The Hall of Concordance was built to make every visitor feel small. Its ceiling vanished into blue-white haze, a dome so vast it seemed to hold a second sky. Rings of floating banners rotated above the assembly floor, each bearing the sigil of a species powerful enough to claim a voice in the Galactic Council. Beneath them, tier upon tier of polished black stone curved around the central chamber like the inside of some ancient amphitheater. To most civilizations, it was a place of awe. To Ambassador Elias Ward of Earth, it was a theater. And today, the Council intended to stage humanity's surrender. At the center dais, High Speaker Talrin adjusted the folds of his silver ceremonial mantle and looked down with cold satisfaction. The avian statesman's golden eyes swept the room, pausing only briefly on the human delegation. Around him sat ministers, admirals, trade envoys, and hereditary rulers from 200-member worlds. They had come not to negotiate, but to witness the end of resistance. For the final time, Talrin declared, his amplified voice rolling through the chamber, the Council extends its terms to the United Systems of Humanity. A luminous document rose above the dais, projected in clean lines of white and blue. Ward read it again, though he already knew every sentence. Humanity would withdraw from the disputed frontier sectors. Human military fleets would be reduced under Council supervision. All future colony expansion would require Council approval. Strategic jump gates in human space would be opened to permanent inspection. In exchange, the Council promised peace, market access, and continued recognition of human sovereignty. Recognition, as if it were theirs to grant. A murmur of approval spread across the chamber. Some delegates leaned back in visible relief. Others wore expressions of barely concealed amusement. They believed this was mercy. They believed Earth had been cornered by sanctions, isolated by propaganda, and weakened by a dozen border provocations disguised as legal disputes. They believed humanity had no way out. Talrin folded his clawed hands. Accept these terms, Ambassador Ward, and the Council will ensure stability for your people. Refuse, his beak curled slightly, and responsibility for what follows will be yours. There it was. Not diplomacy. Not compromise. Submission wrapped in formal language. Ward rose slowly from the human podium. The chamber quieted. He was not physically imposing by the standards of the galaxy. No horns, no armored hide, no ceremonial bioluminescence. Just a dark uniform, silver insignia at the collar, and a stillness that many species found difficult to read. He glanced once at the rotating document, then lifted his eyes to the assembly. The silence stretched longer than protocol allowed. Several delegates shifted impatiently. A few smiled, expecting hesitation to break into pleading. Ward touched the console before him. The terms disappeared from the air. A ripple passed through the room. "High Speaker," he said, calm and even, "the United Systems of Humanity has reviewed the Council's final offer in full." Talrin gave a slow, satisfied nod. "Then state your acceptance for the record." Ward's expression did not change. "No." The word struck the chamber harder than a shouted threat. For one heartbeat, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the hall erupted. Voices crashed over each other in a dozen languages. Shock flashed across alien faces. An insectoid delegate rose so quickly his chair toppled backward. A trade minister from the inner moons began speaking furiously into a private comm channel. Talrin himself froze, as though he had misheard something impossible. Ambassador Ward remained standing amid the chaos, hands clasped behind his back. Because the Council saw only defiance. They did not see the encrypted transmission already leaving Earth. They did not see the sealed orders opening across hidden fleets. And they did not yet understand the most dangerous truth in the room. Humanity had not refused because it was desperate. Humanity had refused because it was ready. The galaxy expected noise after humanity's refusal. It expected outrage, emergency broadcasts, frantic diplomatic pleas, maybe even the theatrical movement of fleets meant to frighten rather than fight. That was how weaker powers behaved when they made a fatal mistake in front of the Galactic Council. They shouted, postured, and begged in the same breath. Humanity did none of those things. In the hours after Ambassador Ward's single-word rejection echoed through the Hall of Concordance, Earth transmitted no public statement. No threat was issued. No channels lit up with panicked arguments. Human embassies across Council space sealed their doors and went dark behind mirrored security fields. Commercial traffic from the Sol system fell by 70% in less than a day. Civilian freighters quietly altered course. Diplomatic staff vanished from receptions, summits, and trade dinners as if they had never been there at all. To most Council observers, it looked like fear. To a handful of experienced strategists, it looked like something worse. In Orbit Chamber 9 above the Council capital, Defense Analyst Seric of the Valori Combine watched streams of data spill across a transparent tactical pane. He was old by Valori standards, his scaled crest dulled with age, and he had spent 3 centuries studying the opening patterns of war. He trusted numbers more than speeches, and the numbers coming from human space were wrong in a way that made his blood run cold. A junior aide approached his station. "Sir, the media channels are calling it a collapse." Sarek did not look up. Media channels are written by people who have never had a world burn. The aide hesitated. "Then what are we seeing?" Sarek expanded the traffic map with a flick of his claw. Thousands of green and gold lines marked ordinary movement between systems. The human sectors, once busy with merchant routes and passenger corridors, were going silent one lane at a time. Not randomly, not chaotically, deliberately. "We are seeing preparation," he said. Elsewhere, the galaxy laughed. On the entertainment feeds of the Thalen worlds, commentators mocked humanity's noble suicide. In the marketplaces of the inner belt, traders sold speculative rights to future mining concessions on human frontier colonies. Several minor member states petitioned the Council for early claims over disputed territories, confident there would soon be nothing left to contest. The phrase human pride became a punchline spoken with easy contempt. Then came the first irregularities. A customs frigate near the Carthan Reach reported that 3 human refinery platforms had powered down and vanished from active registry in under 6 hours. Long-range scans later showed they had not been dismantled. Armor plates had simply unfolded over their industrial hulls, and missile silos had risen from beneath or processing towers. A survey vessel at the edge of the vast frontier sent an urgent burst transmission after detecting heavy mass signatures inside what charts still labeled civilian asteroid works. The message ended mid-sentence. In the agricultural moons around Helios Gate, civilian cargo containers began arriving preloaded not with grain, machine parts, or consumer goods, but with shield generators, replacement reactor cores, and military-grade fabrication units. The reports were scattered, easy to dismiss in isolation, but Sarek assembled them like fragments of a weapon. He requested an emergency audience with the Council Defense Committee. He was granted 6 minutes. "They are not withdrawing," he told the ministers gathered around the orbital chamber. "They are consolidating. Their logistics have shifted from commercial efficiency to wartime survivability. Their silence is not political. It is operational." One minister gave a soft, amused trill. "You believe the humans planned this?" Sarek met the alien's gaze without blinking. "I believe they stopped trying to convince us and began preparing to survive us." A few faces tightened at that. Most did not. By the time the hearing ended, his warning had already been buried beneath stronger voices, louder voices, arrogant voices. The Council had spent too many years believing its own myths. Humanity was divided, they said. Economically weakened. Militarily constrained. Cornered species did not become dangerous. They became obedient. But beyond the frontier, in shipyards hidden inside shattered moons and stations disguised as merchant hubs, cold reactors were waking one by one. And in the deep silence spreading across human space, the first shape of what was coming had already begun to move. The Council chose the Carthan Corridor for its first lesson. It was a narrow chain of systems linking the contested frontier to the wealthy inner routes of human space, and in every simulation run by Council war colleges, it collapsed within hours of sustained assault. The logic seemed flawless. Strike hard, seize the corridor, shatter human morale, and force Earth back to the negotiating table with its pride burned out of it. So the Council assembled a task force large enough to make the point unmistakable. 42 capital ships. Hundreds of escorts. Carrier groups from the Valori Combine, artillery cruisers from the Reth Dominion, interdiction screens supplied by 3 client states eager to prove loyalty. It was not the largest fleet the Council had ever fielded, but it was more than enough for a punitive operation against a species the Chamber still described as isolated and overextended. Supreme Commander Jal Vey watched the fleet translate into the first corridor system in perfect formation. On the tactical display before him, human defensive assets were almost non-existent. A handful of old orbital stations. Sparse patrol signatures. 2 drifting cargo hulks tumbling near a dead moon. He allowed himself a thin smile. "Record everything," he ordered. "When this is done, every member world will see what defiance costs." The fleet advanced. No response came. The first stations were silent, their reactors cold, their docking rings empty. Even the emergency beacons were offline. Boarding teams found abandoned corridors, stripped databanks, and storage bays left open like discarded shells. The human retreat looked hasty, almost pathetic. Some officers laughed. Then they entered the second system. There the silence continued, but now it felt different, more deliberate. Comm buoys were gone. Navigation relays had been cut away from their pylons. Long sensor sweeps returned only static distortion from fields of drifting industrial wreckage scattered across the primary approach lanes. The debris forced the task force to tighten formation and reduce speed. Commander Vey frowned. Clear a path. Before the order finished relaying, one of the drifting hulks split open. Not from explosion. From design. Armor petals unfolded from the freighter's sides. Beneath them, hidden launch cells ignited in a bloom of white fire. Missiles erupted by the hundreds at point-blank range, streaking into the compressed vanguard before shield harmonics could adjust. 2 escorts vanished instantly. A cruiser rolled hard to starboard, hull peeled open like torn metal skin. Then the debris field woke up. What had seemed like wreckage began transmitting target locks. Broken engine sections detonated into clouds of smart shrapnel. Dead satellites fired buried rail cannons. Sensor ghosts became attack drones. Within 12 seconds, the clean Council advance dissolved into chaos. "Ambush!" shouted a bridge officer. "No," Vey snapped, gripping the rail of his command dais as the flagship shuddered under impact. This was prepared. And then the human fleet arrived. It did not surge in dramatically from a single vector. It emerged everywhere at once. Dark signatures peeled from the shadow of the dead moon. Frigates rose from thermal masking fields hidden inside the debris. Heavy destroyers burst from behind shattered station husks with drives already burning hot. They moved in silence, with no broad-spectrum chatter, no wasted flourish, no frantic maneuvering. Each ship slid into position like part of a machine that had been assembled long before the Council ever crossed the border. Their first volley cut straight for command ships. Carrier control arrays vanished in blossoms of fire. 2 battleships lost engine spines to kinetic strikes so precise they looked surgical. Jamming flooded the Council network, blinding squadrons and isolating escorts from Fleet Command. Human corvettes knifed through the confusion, striking exposed flanks and vanishing before return fire could track them. On Vey's display, unit markers began disappearing too fast to count. "Reform line," he roared. But there was no line left to reform. Every retreat vector had already been seeded with mines or blocked by fast attack groups. Every attempt to widen formation opened another weakness. The Council had entered expecting occupation. Humanity had prepared extermination. Bridge alarms screamed. Fire suppression gas hissed from ceiling vents. Somewhere below deck, secondary reactors blew in a chain of muffled concussions. Vey stared at the tactical projection as the truth took shape with brutal clarity. The humans had abandoned the corridor on purpose. They had left just enough emptiness to invite confidence. And now, across the frontier, the same trap was springing shut. By the time the first Council distress calls escaped the Carthan corridor, the galaxy was already learning the war had begun hours earlier than anyone realized, and humanity had fired first long before the first visible shot. By the 3rd day of fighting, panic had reached the Council's inner chambers. Not public panic. Not yet. The markets still opened. News anchors still spoke in controlled tones. Official statements still used phrases like localized reversals and temporary tactical complexity. But behind sealed doors and encrypted channels, the truth was spreading faster than any censorship grid could contain it. Humanity had not improvised this war. Humanity had built it. Defense analyst Sarek stood once more before the Council Defense Committee, and this time no one smiled when he entered. The holographic chamber was dim, lit only by tactical displays hanging in the air like ghosts. System maps bled red along the frontier. Supply routes blinked, then vanished. Fleet identifiers once considered untouchable had gone dark forever. "Begin," said Minister Ullin, his usual arrogance stripped down to fatigue. Sarek touched the control pane. A dead moon appeared above the central table, rotating slowly in pale light. "Designation, Nearest 4, he said. Public Registry classified it as a depleted mining satellite, commercially inactive for 19 standard years. The moon split open in the projection. Beneath its scarred crust lay docks. Reactor arrays. Repair spines. Magrail launch tunnels large enough to throw cruisers into combat fully armed. A silence settled over the chamber. "We estimate," Sarek continued, "that at least 37 similarly disguised facilities exist across human territory. Many were declared obsolete decades ago. Some were listed as environmental hazards. A few were even offered to foreign investors for survey access, but the interior data was fabricated." Minister Ullin leaned forward. "You are telling us they hid military infrastructure in plain sight?" "I am telling you," Sarek said, "that they turned our certainty against us." The projection changed. Cargo lanes filled the chamber, lines of blue threading across dozens of systems. At first glance they seemed ordinary: civilian shipping patterns, freight exchanges, agricultural distribution, bulk or transport. Then new overlays appeared. Every third route connected to fallback depots. Every fifth civilian port aligned with hardened refueling hubs. Warehouse clusters matched ammunition storage ratios. Orbital elevators linked directly to buried bunkers. What the Council had dismissed as messy human commercial expansion revealed itself as something terrifyingly coherent. A wartime skeleton, Sarek said quietly, hidden inside a civilian body. Around the table, ministers stared upward as if the shape of their mistake had become visible at last. For years, Council observers had mocked humanity's lack of elegance. Human cities spread too fast. Their colonies looked improvised. Their trade systems were redundant, inefficient, badly standardized. Alien planners saw disorder and assumed weakness. But humans had not built for beauty. They had built for survival. On the frontier world of Casimir, a farming settlement erased from serious military projections had withstood orbital assault for 11 hours because its irrigation network doubled as coolant circulation for subterranean shield generators. A passenger liner destroyed near the Vorga expanse turned out, on debris analysis, to contain modular drone cores in hidden compartments beneath civilian seating decks. Fuel stations once marked low priority had become fleet anchors, each wrapped in concealed armor and defended by autonomous gun webs. It was everywhere. Years of negotiations had blinded the Council to the most important truth. While diplomats argued in chambers of glass and gold, humanity had never stopped preparing for the moment words failed. And words had failed a long time ago. The final projection rose. Earth, Mars, Titan, Luna, the Belt, frontier sectors, independent habitats, outer research colonies. On every prior Council model, these regions fractured under pressure. Different interests, different governments, different cultures. Too much distance, too much internal strain. Yet the wartime response told a different story. No major secessions, no supply refusals, no colonial riots, no regional fleet mutinies. Human space, so often mocked as noisy and divided, had tightened like a single fist. Minister Ulan swallowed. How? Sarek looked at him for a long moment. Because you misunderstood what holds them together, he said. You thought comfort united them. Trade, prosperity, access. You believed pressure would make them bargain against one another. The old analyst let the system map spin above them, red and blue lines crossing like open wounds. But humans do not become most dangerous when they are prosperous, he said. They become most dangerous when they agree on what must never be taken from them. No one answered, because outside the chamber, another emergency alert had already begun to sound. And for the first time in centuries, the Galactic Council was starting to understand that it had not cornered a young species into submission. It had forged one into unity. By the seventh day, the Galactic Council no longer spoke like an empire. It spoke like a structure trying not to hear the sounds of its own collapse. Emergency sessions ran without pause in the Hall of Concordance. Delegates who had once arrived draped in jeweled confidence now came sleepless, hurried, and surrounded by military aides. The floating banners above the chamber still turned in stately circles, but beneath them the mood had changed beyond recognition. Gone were the polished phrases about measured response and lawful enforcement. In their place came casualty reports, supply failures, and accusations sharp enough to draw blood. The war had spread exactly where the Council insisted it could not. Not into its strongest core worlds, but into the fragile seams holding the alliance together. Convoys vanished along inner trade routes after human raiders struck logistics hubs once considered untouchable. Client species, promised protection in exchange for loyalty, began transmitting frantic distress calls when Council fleets failed to arrive. Old rivals inside the alliance started withholding reinforcements, each fearful that committing too much would leave their own borders exposed. Entire sectors that had supported punitive action against humanity only days earlier now demanded local withdrawal and independent defense authority. The Council had expected a clean lesson. Instead, it had triggered a chain reaction. In the midst of the chaos, a secure transmission arrived from Earth. Not a plea. Not a surrender. Terms. They were brief enough to fit on a single display pane, and devastating enough to silence every conversation in the chamber. Immediate cessation of all offensive fleet movements into human territory. Recognition of all disputed frontier systems as sovereign human holdings. Permanent withdrawal of Council inspection authority from human gates, shipyards, and colonies. Full reparations review for seized cargo, destroyed civilian infrastructure, and unlawful sanctions. And one final condition, colder than the rest. The Council would never again claim jurisdiction over humanity's future. For several seconds after the terms appeared, no one spoke. Then the chamber exploded. "This is extortion," shouted a Reth delegate, striking his podium hard enough to crack the display surface. "It is reality," answered another, voice trembling. "Our fleets are breaking." A trade minister from the inner moons demanded renewed escalation. A border envoy from the Valori Combine countered with evidence that 3 more supply chains had already failed. 2 client states formally declared emergency neutrality before the session had even ended. Another threatened to secede from Council defense obligations entirely unless its surviving carriers were recalled. The fracture lines were no longer hidden. They were widening in full view of the galaxy. High Speaker Tauren, once the embodiment of Council certainty, stood at the center dais looking older than he had a week before. His silver mantle hung crooked around his shoulders. When he finally raised his voice for order, it came out thin. "Bring in the human ambassador," he said. The doors opened. Ambassador Elias Ward entered the Hall of Concordance with the same measured pace he had worn when he first rejected the Council's final offer. His uniform was unchanged. His expression was unchanged. But the room was not. Now alien eyes followed him not with contempt, but with something far rarer. Calculation. Caution. Fear. Ward stopped at the human podium and looked up at the chamber that had expected to witness his people bow. Tauren's beak tightened. "You have made your point." Ward said nothing. The High Speaker gestured toward the projected terms. "If the Council accepts these conditions, will humanity halt further operations?" Ward let the silence settle. He knew the power of it now. He knew they finally understood. "When we refused your offer," he said at last, his voice steady enough to cut through the chamber without force, "you believed peace was something you granted us. A privilege. A restraint. A chain you could tighten or loosen." He looked slowly across the assembled delegates. "You were wrong." No one interrupted. "Peace," Ward continued, "exists only when both sides agree that the future cannot be owned by the strong at the expense of the free. You ended that peace long before this war began. We simply chose the day we would stop pretending otherwise." The Hall of Concordance had never been quieter. Then Ward delivered the words that would be replayed on 1,000 worlds for generations. "You offered humanity a place beneath your authority," he said. "Now you will learn what it means when humanity refuses to kneel, and refuses to ask again." And in that silence, with alliances cracking, fleets burning, and the Council forced to swallow terms it had never imagined accepting, everything changed. Because the moment humanity rejected submission, the galaxy had entered a new age. one where the council no longer decided the limits of human destiny.